What would you do if your HOA slapped you with a $250,000 fine for living on your own land? I never thought a $250,000 envelope on my fence would drag an entire luxury neighborhood into a war. When the HOA claimed I was trespassing, I dug up the old boundary stakes my father set and found out Creekside was built on my land. So tell me, what would you do if an entire wealthy neighborhood was sitting on your property? The sun had only just begun to lift itself over the jagged Montana ridge when Remy Cole stepped out onto his porch, boots sinking slightly into the cold morning dust. At 68, he still woke with the same quiet discipline he'd carried from his dam engineering days. Up before the light, coffee before the wind picked up, chores before the rest of the valley even stirred. The air smelled of wet sage and the faint iron tang that rose off the lake whenever the temperature dropped overnight. It was a peaceful hour, the kind that usually eased the ache in his shoulders and quieted the loneliness that came in the years after his wife passed. But not today. Something was wrong the moment he reached the first fence post along the cattle path. A bright white corner of paper fluttered against the wooden beam, pinned there by a thin metal tack, like a warning nailed to a frontier door. It wasn't one of his notes to himself. The handwriting was too sharp, too formal, too hostile, and it wasn't a neighbor's message either. Folks around here didn't leave things tacked to fences unless it was an emergency or a rattlesnake sighting. He tugged the paper free. It didn't budge. It was thick, far thicker than any ranch notice should be, wrapped in an official-looking certified mail envelope, the kind that smelled faintly of toner and procedural arrogance. The return address stamped across the front read, Creekside Bluffs Homeowners Association, printed in gold lettering, bold enough to make his stomach tighten. Well, that can't be good, Remy muttered to the wind. He carefully pried the envelope loose and opened it right there against the fence, bracing it on the worn wood as the breeze threatened to snatch the pages away. A packet unfolded, heavy, glossy, expensive, dropping a faint dusting of paper fibers onto his boots. The first line hit him like a kick from a stubborn mule. Notice of violation. Total fines due, $250,000. Remy blinked once, twice, pressing the paper closer to his face as if it might read differently under a different angle of sunlight. But the words stayed where they were, severe, smug, insulting. They were accusing him of trespassing, him, on his own land. According to the HOA, his barn sat 50 feet into community green space. His goat shed encroached upon a protected recreation corridor, and his fence line, built by his father's hands half a century ago, had violated a newly established property buffer zone. He let out a slow breath, the kind that came from somewhere deep and tired. These folks have lost their damn minds. He looked down from his fence line toward the valley where Creekside Bluffs sprawled, rows of immaculate mansions gleaming in the early light, their windows catching the sun like polished mirrors. 5 years ago, this entire slope had been nothing but open grass and wandering cattle. Developers had promised luxury rural living without ever mentioning what they planned to do to the people already living rurally. Now they were building pools, tennis courts, and fountains, most of which Remy ignored, because a man could tolerate a lot so long as he kept his land. But this? A $250,000 fine? On structures older than the HOA president herself? He flipped through the packet again, scanning line after line of polished legalese. Words like seizure, mandatory removal, non-compliance penalties jumped out at him, each one sharp enough to raise the hairs on his arms. But what struck him hardest was the tone. This wasn't a conversation. This was a threat. He ran his thumb along the rough grain of the fence post, remembering how his father had carved initials into it when Remy was a boy. The land wasn't just coordinates on paper. It was history, sweat, stubbornness, and family. And the HOA was telling him he didn't belong on it. The wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of construction machines from the valley. Somewhere far below, a crane beeped as it backed up, invisible through the morning haze but loud enough to remind him of everything that had changed since the developers came. The soft lowing of cattle drifted in from the meadow behind him. Steady, grounding, familiar. Remy folded the envelope shut, jaw tight. There was only one question echoing in his mind, louder than the construction noise, louder than the insult of that fine. Why was the HOA suddenly claiming ownership of land his family had held for generations? He didn't know the answer yet, but he knew where the rabbit hole started, and he was damn sure going to follow it. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted into that blazing Montana gold, the kind that made every pine needle sparkle and every dust mote glow. Remy stood by his goat pen, tightening a loose board, when the distant rumble of tires on gravel made his spine stiffen. It wasn't the slow crawl of a neighbor's pickup or the familiar hum of the mail truck. This was heavier, faster, determined. A polished black SUV came into view, sunlight glinting off its chrome grille as it barreled down his dirt road like it didn't know the meaning of respect or brakes. Behind it followed a silver sedan and, strangely, a county sheriff's cruiser. For a moment, Remy wondered if someone in the valley had gotten hurt. But the way the SUV swung its nose into his gate, too sharp, too entitled, told him exactly what kind of trouble was stepping onto his land. The SUV door flew open before the dust had even settled. Out stepped Bethany Reed, bright pink suit, heels sharp enough to punch holes in the earth, red clipboard clutched in one hand like a courtroom weapon. Her sunglasses were oversized, her expression even larger, tight, disapproving, and radiating the confidence of someone who believed power came from paperwork. "Well," Remy muttered under his breath, "the queen herself." She pushed open his cattle gate without so much as a knock, the rusty hinges groaning under her impatient shove. Two HOA board members followed behind her, one carrying a slim laptop bag, the other holding a stack of rolled maps. The sheriff's deputy, young and uncomfortable looking, trailed several feet behind as if he'd been dragged into something he didn't fully understand. "Mr. Cole," Bethany announced, voice slicing through the warm afternoon like a blade through canvas. "I trust you've received our formal notice?" Remy wiped his hands on his jeans, keeping his posture steady, calm. "Got your envelope," he said. "Didn't appreciate the number on it. Thought maybe it was a typo. Maybe you added a few too many zeros after lunch." Bethany smiled, but it wasn't a smile meant for people. It was a smile meant for winning. "I assure you, the amount is accurate. Your structures are in clear violation of Creekside Bluffs' property standards and boundary regulations." She thrust the red clipboard toward him, stopping barely 6 inches from his chest. The paper on top showed a highlighted list of violations, each line bolded, each fine more outrageous than the last. Remy gently pushed the clipboard away. "Bethany, that barn's been standing since the year Elvis bought his first Cadillac. My father built it when there wasn't a mansion in sight." "Yes," she said sweetly. "And while we respect history, Creekside Bluffs is now a regulated community. Property lines have been updated. Your barn, goat shed, and fence line extend onto HOA-maintained green space." Remy let out a slow breath through his nose. "Green space?" he repeated. "Ma'am, that land was nothing but thistleweed and coyote tracks until you folks paved it over to build your mail kiosk." One of the board members tapped his laptop nervously. "Property boundaries were resurveyed in 2012, Mr. Cole. Everything is documented." Remy narrowed his eyes. 2012? Funny. Nobody told me. I didn't sign anything. Didn't see any survey crews. Didn't hear a word about it. Bethany lifted her chin, smug and patient. "Your participation wasn't required. The HOA acted under legal rights granted by the community charter." "Community charter?" Remy echoed, incredulous. "My land isn't part of your community." "Oh, but the updated boundaries say otherwise," she said, her voice a purr coated in condescension. "Sometimes older residents lose track of where their property actually ends." That one struck deep. Sharper than any fine, sharper than any insult. She wasn't just questioning his land. She was questioning his mind. Before he could respond, the gate behind them squeaked open again. Remy glanced over to see Sarah Mitchell, his 72-year-old neighbor, shuffling in with her walking stick. Her gray braid swung behind her like a rope of defiance. "Remy's fence hasn't moved an inch in the 28 years I've lived next door," she declared loudly. "Not an inch. I watched him fix it after that big storm in '04, right where his daddy put it." Bethany's smile thinned. "Mrs. Mitchell, with all respect, memories can be imperfect at your age." Sarah bristled. "Imperfect, my foot. I remember that fence better than I remember my wedding date." The deputy cleared his throat. "Ma'am, just here to observe," he murmured, uncomfortable with all sides of the conversation. Remy stepped forward, holding out his own folder now, weathered, edges soft from decades of storage but clean inside. He opened it to show the deed his father signed, the survey lines marked in precise pen strokes only an engineer could make. "This is my land," Remy said quietly. "Been in my family long before Creekside bluffs popped up." Bethany didn't even lean in to look. She waved a perfectly manicured hand as though brushing away dust. "Outdated documentation," she said. "The 2012 survey supersedes all previous descriptions, and I assure you, it was conducted professionally." She leaned closer, voice dropping into a threat disguised as civility. "You have 30 days to remove every structure encroaching on HOA property, barn, goat shed, fence, everything, or we'll pursue legal seizure." Remy felt something inside him go very still. Not rage, not fear, just certainty. He looked her straight in the eye. "You're making a mistake," he said softly. Bethany's lipstick curled upward. "No, Mr. Cole, you are." She turned on her heel, motioning for her entourage to follow. Red clipboard tucked under her arm like a trophy already won. The SUV engines roared back to life as dust lifted in thick plumes behind them. Remy watched the convoy leave, then stared down at the deed in his hands. Behind him, the wind rattled the fence rails, as if reminding him that wood could bend, but truth couldn't. Sarah touched his elbow gently. "You all right, Remy?" "No," he said, eyes fixed on the valley where the mansions gleamed. "But I will be." He gathered the papers, tucked them under his arm, and started walking toward the storage shed where he kept old boxes, heavy ones filled with maps, tools, and forgotten records from his engineering days. Because if Bethany Reed wanted to play games with surveys, Remy Cole knew exactly where to start digging. The storage shed sat a little ways behind the goat pen, its tin roof weather-worn and humming softly as the late afternoon wind rolled in from the ridge. Remy swung the door open, inhaling the scent of old lumber, motor oil, and the faint musk of trapped summer heat. Sunlight slanted through the boards, cutting stripes across stacks of dusty crates marked with years his father had scribbled in pencil. 78, 83, 96. He knelt, joints popping like they always did after a long day, and pulled out the crate labeled Surveys, Original. Inside lay rolled maps, topo sheets, and plotting tools he hadn't touched in years. He smiled despite himself. Funny how the past had a way of waiting patiently for the right moment to be needed again. He lifted out an old metal detector, its handle scratched, its coil patched with electrical tape. The thing still hummed when he switched it on, a shaky but persistent whine that felt like an old friend waking up. "Still got some life in you," he murmured. As he straightened, the crunch of tires on gravel came from the road beyond his barn. Not like the HOA convoy earlier, this was a softer, familiar rumble. A silver pickup coasted to a stop, dust curling around it. The door opened, and out stepped Jake Mercer. Mid-40s, sunburned neck, survey vest faded from years of field work. Jake gave a grin that tugged more to one side than the other. "Heard you got yourself in a spat with Creekside Bluffs." Remy snorted. "Spat? They want to fine me 250 grand for living on my own land." Jake let out a whistle. "Well, hell, that'll do it." They shook hands, the grip strong, steady, the kind of handshake born from long days in the field and trust built over years. "I figured Bethany would try something eventually," Jake said as he followed Remy toward the fence. "HOA's been sniffing around every property up this slope. You're just the first they were brave enough to poke." "Brave," Remy muttered. "Stupid's the word I'd use." They reached the fence line just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in streaks of apricot and rust. The cattle moved lazily in the distance, bells clinking softly as they grazed. Remy pointed to the ground. "The first stake should be somewhere right around here. Dad and I set it when I was 16. Never touched it since." Jake scanned the area thoughtfully, then lifted his GPS rover, its antenna blinking green against the dusky light. The device beeped to life, chirping in quick bursts as satellite lock acquired. "That old deed of yours?" Jake asked. "Inside," Remy replied. "Coordinates still match what Dad wrote down." "Good," Jake said. "Let's see where the truth leads." The metal detector moaned as it swept over the earth, warbling near a patch of imported landscaping stones. Smooth river rocks that definitely weren't native to Remy's land. Jake raised an eyebrow. "HOA bring these in?" "Developers," Remy said. "Dumped them everywhere when they built those mansions." Jake nudged the rocks aside with his boot, then crouched. The detector wailed louder, urgent, insistent. "There's something under here." They dug with gloved hands and a small trowel, the soil stubborn and dry from years of neglect. A few inches down, Jake's fingers clinked against metal. "There she is," he whispered. They brushed off the dirt to reveal a rusted iron stake, its head stamped with a barely visible marking. C-27. The exact code Remy's father had recorded on the original plat. A quiet rush of relief and anger washed over Remy all at once. "That stake's been here longer than Bethany's HOA's been alive," he said. Jake nodded grimly. "And according to this," he tapped the GPS monitor, "your fence isn't on their property. If anything, it's inside your boundary by a good 40, 50 feet. Meaning my fence isn't the problem," Remy finished. "Their map is." They lifted their eyes toward the valley. From this angle, the new mansions glittered like polished stones. Big windows, big porches, big driveways. Shadows stretched long behind them, as if trying to hide something. Jake swept the detector again, toward the direction of the HOA's meticulously groomed walking trail. It wailed a second time. Hard. "Another one?" Remy asked. "Oh yeah," Jake said. "And if this one's buried under their fancy shrub line..." He didn't need to finish. They moved further down, digging again. Another stake. Another original boundary marker. This one directly under Creekside's decorative stone edging. It took only minutes for the truth to become undeniable. The HOA's green space wasn't theirs at all. It was Remy's. A wind gust rolled across the ridge, kicking up dust and tossing loose hay into the air. Remy squinted against it, heart pounding, not from fear but from a rising clarity. "Jake," he said quietly, "if these stakes match my old deed..." Jake gave a slow, steady nod. "Then those mansions down there might be sitting on your land." For a moment, there was only silence. The wind, the distant hum of crickets, a faint echo of construction machinery far below. Remy exhaled. Not a breath of relief. A breath of realization. Heavy, inevitable, dangerous. "Well," he said, voice low, Looks like Bethany Reed's updated survey just bought her a whole heap of trouble. Jake chuckled darkly. You ready to see how deep this goes? Remy looked toward the valley, where evening light cast long shadows across manicured lawns and glittering windows. As ready as I'll ever be. Night settled quickly over the ranch. The wind picked up, carrying the cool bite of mountain air and the faint scent of pine sap drifting down from the ridge. Remy and Jake moved into the house, spreading old maps and fresh GPS readouts across the kitchen table. The overhead bulb flickered once before steadying, casting a warm amber glow over the papers. Jake pulled his reading glasses up the bridge of his nose, flipping open the packet Bethany's HOA had sent. He laid the alleged 2012 survey next to the original 1970s deed. The contrast was immediate and troubling. The original deed was yellowed, edges worn, hand-inked with precise notation common to mid-century surveying, compass bearings, chain measurements, elevation markers. His father's handwriting looped in the margins, neat and careful. The newer survey, by comparison, was glossy, printed, polished. But the more Jake inspected it, the stranger it became. Remy, he murmured, tracing a finger across the logo at the top. You see this? Remy leaned forward, arms crossed against the table. What am I looking at? Jake tapped the survey company name. Silver Range Geomapping. You ever heard of them? Nope, Remy said, but that doesn't mean much. It does, Jake said, tone tightening. Because I have. And they shut down in 2008. 4 years before this document says they filed this map. Remy's brow furrowed. You're sure? Jake nodded sharply. Absolutely. My old boss did contract work for them back in the day. They went under fast, lost their licensing, closed their offices. Haven't stamped a single map since. He lifted the survey again, inspecting the signatures at the bottom. Well, I'll be damned, Jake whispered. This isn't even their handwriting. Remy felt a slow burn crawl up his neck. Meaning what? Meaning, Jake said, leaning back, this map is either forged or altered. The signatures are scanned from old documents. The dates don't match the company's timeline. And look at the coordinates. Half of these numbers don't align with any legitimate survey practices. They're too clean. Too perfect. Remy stared at the paper, anger settling in like cold steel. So Bethany hadn't just gotten bad information. She had used a document that shouldn't exist. Jake continued flipping, his expression growing darker with each page. Look here. They've shifted your northern boundary 52 feet downslope, and on the western side, they cut off nearly 70 feet. If someone wanted to make room for those big houses, they'd shrink the old rancher's property lines, Remy finished. Jake nodded. Exactly. A storm clouded the kitchen window, a slow-moving darkness creeping over the valley. In the distance, thunder rumbled off the mountains, echoing through the open fields like a warning. Remy exhaled and pressed his palms flat on the table. So the HOA is fining me using a fake map. Looks like it. And they expect the county to back it up. They might, Jake said grimly, if nobody's looked closely. Folks trust shiny papers. Rain began to drum softly on the tin roof. The steady rhythm filled the silence between them. Remy's mind wandered back to the moment he first saw that envelope pinned to his fence. The arrogance of it. The assumption that he'd be too old, too tired, or too naive to challenge them. But he wasn't. And now he had proof, at least enough to start asking questions. Jake stood and stretched, rubbing the back of his neck. We're gonna need to check those stakes along the southern boundary tomorrow. If 2 are real, the rest probably are too. Remy nodded. And what happens if those stakes say the developers built on my land? Jake let out a slow whistle. Then they've got a big problem. A very big problem. He packed up his equipment and headed for the door, pausing on the porch as lightning flickered far out over the plains. "Remy, you realize what this means, right?" Jake asked quietly. "That they lied?" Remy said. "That they stole," Jake corrected. "And not just from you, from anyone whose land they wanted." Remy looked past him at the valley where Creekside bluffs glowed with soft, golden porch lights. The mansions lined up like trophies behind neatly trimmed hedges. "What do you think their reaction will be?" Remy asked. Jake gave a humorless chuckle. "Denial, anger, legal tantrums, maybe even desperation. Folks with money don't like being told they're wrong." Another flash of lightning illuminated his face. "And Remy, Bethany Reed's mansion is right in the middle of the boundary shift." The information hit Remy harder than the thunder that followed. Bethany, the smug woman in the pink suit who'd marched onto his ranch and called his father's documents outdated, might be living on stolen soil. "So, what do we do next?" Remy asked. Jake held up the forged survey. "Expose this," he said, "and make them answer for it." The rain came down harder now, tapping like impatient fingers on the porch roof. The air felt charged, heavy, and waiting. Remy nodded once, slow and deliberate. "If they think I'm just gonna let this slide," he said, "they picked the wrong old man." Jake smiled, but there was no joy in it. "Tomorrow, we start digging up the rest of the truth." "Rest good," Remy said. "We'll need our strength." Jake headed back to his truck, wipers sweeping rain off the windshield as he drove away. Remy stood on the porch long after the taillights vanished, listening to the storm swallow the valley. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because the storm wasn't the threat. It was the truth rising underneath it. By the time the storm passed, the world felt scrubbed clean, washed in that crisp Montana air that always followed a night of hard rain. The morning sun glinted off puddles scattered across the dirt road leading toward Creekside bluffs, each reflecting the bright white mansions perched neatly along the valley slope. But even in that beauty, something felt off, like the whole place was pretending to be cleaner than it really was. Remy tightened his jacket against the lingering chill and loaded his folder of documents into the back seat of his truck. Jake had texted before dawn. HOA called an emergency meeting. 4 p.m. They want you there. "Well," Remy muttered as he shut the door, "if they want a show, they'll get one." He drove down the winding road, past the rust-colored bluffs and the lake shimmering under a morning breeze. Cattle watched lazily as he passed, flicking their tails through patches of damp grass. By the time he reached the paved entrance of Creekside bluffs, the difference in worlds was already striking. Neatly trimmed lawns, bright white fences, and freshly laid asphalt replacing dirt and gravel. Cars were everywhere. SUVs, sedans, a few luxury electric things that didn't look like they belonged anywhere near a ranching community. Folks dressed like they were attending a business conference instead of a neighborhood meeting. Remy parked near the back, taking a moment before stepping out. He wasn't nervous, but he wasn't eager either. He didn't like spectacle. He liked truth. And today, truth was going to hit a room full of people who weren't ready for it. The community center was buzzing when he walked in. Voices layered over one another in tense murmurs. Heads turned his way, some curious, some angry, some already forming opinions based on gossip rather than fact. Then he saw her, Bethany Reed, polished and poised, seated at a long head table like she was presiding over a trial. Her bright pink suit looked freshly pressed, and her hair was styled into a crisp bob that didn't move when she spoke. She leaned toward the microphone. "Mr. Cole," she said, voice filling the room, "thank you for attending. Please take a seat." Her tone wasn't an invitation. It was an order, one meant to show power. Remy ignored her gesture and found a seat in the back row. He wasn't there to play her game. He was there to end it. The meeting opened with formality and posturing. A slideshow illuminated the wall. Photos of Remy's barn, goat shed, fence line, cropped to make everything look menacing, like his ranch was some sort of outlaw camp intruding on the HOA's peaceful paradise. Bethany leaned toward the microphone again. "For months," she announced, "our community has suffered from ongoing encroachments by Mr. Cole. Our updated survey confirms significant boundary violations." A few residents murmured in agreement. Others whispered anxiously. Remy sat still, hands folded, watching. A board member spoke next, emphasizing community standards and unacceptable structures. Another chimed in about property value risks. A third highlighted the legal consequences of failing to comply. It was a well-rehearsed performance, but it wasn't the truth. Bethany finally turned to him with practiced sympathy. "Mr. Cole, we'd like to offer you the chance to speak before we proceed." Remy stood slowly, the room falling into a hush. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply reached for the folder he'd carried in, pulled it open, and placed a USB drive on the nearby table. "I brought someone else to speak instead," he said. The door at the back opened, and Jake Mercer stepped inside carrying his survey equipment and laptop. A ripple went through the room, some residents sitting up straighter, others whispering to one another. Bethany's smile faltered. "And who is this?" "A licensed surveyor," Jake said, setting his laptop down near the projector. 20 years of field experience, more than enough to check your numbers." Bethany pressed her lips together. "We didn't authorize—" "You don't have to," Remy cut in. "The truth doesn't need permission." Jake connected the laptop. With a click, the projector lit up again, this time showing a clean, modern aerial image of the entire valley. On top of it, he began layering GPS data. "This," he said, "is Mr. Cole's original deed boundary, verified by 3 satellite lock points and multiple on-site markers." A thin red line appeared on the screen, tracing a shape around Remy's property. Jake clicked again. "This is the boundary claimed in your 2012 survey." A second line, blue, overlapped the red at the top, then drifted dramatically downslope, shrinking Remy's land and swallowing the areas where the new mansions now stood. The room gasped. Jake clicked a third time. "This," he said, voice steady as steel, "is where we found the original iron survey stakes. Every one of them. They match the 1970s deed exactly." Dots appeared on the screen. Small, glowing markers revealing the truth that had been buried, literally, beneath decorative landscaping. Jake zoomed in. One stake was directly under a mansion's patio extension, another under a stone path leading to a hot tub, a third beneath the edge of a tennis court, and the largest surprise, a stake beneath the corner of Bethany's infinity pool. A murmur swept through the room like a gust of wind through tall grass. Bethany turned pale. Jake stepped back. "Your 2012 survey? It's fabricated. The company it's signed under shut down years before the survey date. Coordinates don't align with any professional standard. Someone created a map that doesn't exist." The room fell silent. Not a whisper. Not a cough. Remy finally stepped forward. "I didn't trespass on your land," he said quietly. "You built on mine." Bethany gripped the sound, table's edge, knuckles white. This isn't possible. This is outrageous." "No," Jake said. "This is measurable, and measurements don't lie." Remy let the silence stretch, let the truth settle into every corner of the room, until even the chandelier seemed to hold its breath. Then he asked the question everyone was now too frightened to speak. "So, Bethany, what happens now that the pool you fined me over is sitting on my property?" A collective gasp rolled through the audience. Bethany's face drained of color, and for the first time since she'd marched onto his ranch, she looked unsure. Small even. The tide had turned. The truth had spoken. Bethany's face drained of color, and for the first time since she'd marched onto his ranch, she looked unsure. Small even. The tide had turned. The truth had spoken. But truth has a way of doing more than shifting a room. It can crack it wide open. For several long seconds, the community center sat frozen in silence. Not a chair creaked. Not a whisper dared escape. You could almost hear the hum of the projector fighting to stay cool as the bright red boundary lines glowed across the wall, cutting neatly through patios, garages, luxury kitchens, and Bethany Reed's prized infinity pool. Then the room erupted. Voices collided like thunder rolling down a canyon. Some shouted, some accused. A few swore under their breath, but kept their eyes glued to the glowing boundary map. More than one homeowner stood up so quickly their chair toppled backward and clattered across the polished floor. A man in a navy sport coat jabbed a finger at Bethany. "You told us the survey was certified." A woman in pearl earrings shook her head, eyes wide. "My patio renovation is sitting on someone else's property? You've got to be kidding me." An older gentleman squeezed the bridge of his nose. "I spent $80,000 extending my garage." "And you built it on my land," Remy said quietly from the back row. That shut him up. Others weren't so quick to settle. The foster couple, who lived in one of the grander homes overlooking the lake, were whisper arguing, their voices tight with panic. Another resident paced in short, frantic lines, muttering to himself as though trying to wake up from a bad dream. But the loudest reaction came from one of Bethany's own board members. "Nobody told me the 2012 survey was fake," he shouted over the noise. "You said it came from the county archives." Bethany's jaw trembled as she tried to steady herself. She rose from her chair with the grace of someone who hoped posture alone could rebuild authority. "Everyone calm down," she commanded into the microphone. This is clearly some kind of misunderstanding. We need time to verify the data and—" Jake cut her off before she could rewrite the narrative. "The data is verified. Every coordinate, every stake, every sheet of original paperwork. You can check it yourselves." "Mr. Mercer," Bethany snapped, "your involvement in HOA business is unauthorized." "Truth doesn't need authorization," Remy said, standing. That stirred the room again, but Remy didn't raise his voice. He walked slowly down the aisle, boots echoing on the hardwood floor. The smell of pine cleaner and old carpet felt strangely out of place in that room full of panic. He stopped near the projector screen, pointing calmly to the red lines marking the original boundary. "You folks built your homes thinking everything was legal. I get that. But what your developer did, and what this HOA continued to enforce, was illegal. My father's markers have been in the ground since before half of you were born." Someone near the front raised a shaking hand. "So, what happens now?" Before Remy could answer, another voice cut through the chaos. "Legal action," said a tense man near the aisle. "Retaining walls, patios, porches, everything will have to be inspected. This is a lawsuit waiting to happen." "Against who?" another homeowner barked. "The HOA? The developer? The surveyor? The county? Or that man over there who actually owns half this neighborhood?" He pointed at Remy. All eyes shifted back toward him. Remy didn't flinch. "I didn't create this mess," he said. "I'm just protecting what's mine." Bethany slammed her clipboard onto the table. "This is ridiculous. You're all listening to a retired engineer and some backyard surveyor." Jake raised his brows. "Backyard? I have state certification, a 20-year record, and equipment more accurate than anything used on the 2012 survey." Bethany's lips tightened, but before she could counter, her own deputy board member leaned toward her. "Bethany, did you know the survey was fake?" he whispered, forgetting the microphone picked up everything. The whisper echoed across the speakers. Her eyes widened with panic. Of course not. I was told it was valid. The developer provided the documents years ago. Then why didn't you verify it with the county? Another board member demanded. Why didn't you notify the original landowners? Someone else shouted. Why didn't you tell us our houses weren't actually built inside the platted lots? Bethany's voice rose to a desperate pitch. We couldn't have known. Jake folded his arms. But you acted like you did. The room descended into full-blown chaos now. Chairs scraped loudly across the floor. Homeowners flooded the front stage area, waving their violation notices, demanding answers, pressing Bethany for explanations she no longer seemed capable of giving. Meanwhile, Remy stepped back, letting the arguments swirl around him without stepping into them. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to expose the truth, and the truth was spreading fast. After several minutes of escalating disorder, with lawyers being called on cell phones, with papers shuffling, with voices growing more frantic, the sheriff's deputy who had accompanied Bethany earlier finally stepped forward. That's enough, he said firmly. This meeting's out of control. Folks need to settle down before someone gets hurt. His presence didn't calm the crowd entirely, but it quieted enough for the tension to simmer rather than boil. Remy turned to leave, but just before he stepped through the door, Bethany's voice cracked over the microphone. We're not done with this, Mr. Cole, she snapped, breath unsteady. You won't win. We'll bring in real lawyers, real experts. This isn't over. Remy paused at the threshold. Rainwater dripping from the eaves just beyond. The breeze carrying the cool scent of wet earth into the heated room behind him. He turned just enough for Bethany to see the calm in his eyes. No, he said. It's just getting started. As he walked out into the twilight, Jake caught up beside him, shaking his head. She's panicking, Jake said. Good, Remy replied. Panicked folks make mistakes, and she's about to make a big one. Jake exhaled. You ready for what's next? Remy eyed the glowing mansions scattered across the valley, like oversized ornaments on land that had never belonged to them at all. They started this fight, he said, but the law's gonna finish it. The following weeks rolled in like an early winter storm, slow at first, then sudden, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Word of the HOA meeting spread across town faster than wildfire in dry brush. Folks at the feed store whispered about it. The clerk at the post office raised an eyebrow whenever Remy walked in. Even the ranchers who rarely crossed into Creekside territory found reasons to drive their pickups past the entrance, just to stare at the white fences dividing old land from new money. Remy spent most days gathering everything he thought he might need. Old records from his father, signed transfer deeds, photographs of him as a teenager mending that same fence line with a hammer too big for his hand. Jake visited almost every afternoon, often covered in dirt from surveying half the valley by himself. And then came the inevitable, the court summons. A plain envelope this time, but with the heavy seriousness of government printing. The hearing was scheduled for mid-morning at the county courthouse in Ridgewater, the nearest town with a judge experienced in land disputes. Remy let the envelope rest on the kitchen table for a long moment before sliding it toward Jake. Well, he said, looks like we're getting our day. Jake nodded slowly. About time the right people hear all this. The morning of the hearing broke cold and glassy. Frost clung to the tips of Remy's pasture grass, catching the pale light before melting into silver droplets. He dressed carefully, clean jeans, a pressed shirt, and the same leather jacket he'd worn to his first engineering job interview nearly 50 years ago. He didn't bother with a tie. He didn't need to pretend to be someone else. When he pulled up to the courthouse, a knot of people stood gathered outside, homeowners, reporters, curious locals. The murmur of conversation buzzed like low static. He spotted Sarah Mitchell standing near the steps, leaning on her walking stick, bundled in a faded denim coat. "Morning, Remy," she said warmly. "Didn't expect you to come," he replied. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. High windows let in slanted beams of dusty sunlight that stretched across the wooden benches. At the front, Judge Margaret Hale, stern, sharp-eyed, and known for having no patience for foolishness, adjusted her glasses as she reviewed the docket. On the opposite side of the room, Bethany Reed sat stiffly with her attorneys. Two men in charcoal suits, who looked like they'd bill her for every breath they took. Bethany's bright pink suit was gone, replaced with a slate gray blazer that looked as uncomfortable on her as humility. Jake slid into the seat beside Remy, setting his equipment bag at his feet. "They brought in the heavy hitters," he muttered. "Those guys charge more per hour than my truck's worth." "Doesn't matter," Remy said. "Truth's cheaper." When the judge called the case, everyone rose. Her voice carried through the chamber like a hammer on an anvil, measured, steady, impossible to ignore. "This is a boundary dispute between Mr. Remy Cole and the Creekside Bluffs Homeowners Association," she said. "Given the material presented, we will examine the evidence thoroughly." Bethany's lead attorney stood first, launching into a practiced argument about community integrity and standard compliance. His words flowed smooth as varnish. Updated surveys, shared responsibility, consistent usage, reasonable enforcement. But they left a bitter taste, the kind Remy knew came from half-truths mixed with expensive polish. When the attorney finished, the judge nodded toward Remy's side. "Mr. Cole, your response?" Remy rose slowly, feeling every eye settle on him. He wasn't a polished speaker. He wasn't dressed like someone with influence. But his voice held something else entirely. History. "My father built that fence with his hands," he began. "Put those stakes in the ground long before Creekside was even drawn on paper. I didn't move them. I didn't alter them. I just lived on the land we've always had." He held up the worn deed. "This is the truth. Has been for 50 years. The judge studied him for a long moment before nodding to Jake. "Mr. Mercer, please present your findings." Jake connected his laptop to the courtroom monitor. The same aerial map filled the screen, brighter, clearer than it had looked in the HOA meeting. He switched to a live GPS feed, the device blinking green as it pinged satellite coordinates in real time. "These readings," Jake said, clicking through charts and overlays, "match the original boundary markers we found buried under imported landscaping throughout Creekside Bluffs." He zoomed in dramatically, showing the coordinates lining up with the rusty stakes they'd dug up days earlier. "And this," he added, pulling up another document, "is the 2012 survey the HOA used." The judge's eyebrows rose as he explained its inconsistencies, impossible coordinates, a company that no longer existed, mismatched signatures. "In my professional opinion," Jake concluded, "this survey wasn't just incorrect. It was fabricated." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Then came the moment Remy hadn't expected but had hoped for: Sarah Mitchell's testimony. Though her voice trembled slightly, her words were clear. "I watched the original stakes," she said. "Saw 'em as a young mother. They were where Remy says they were. And I saw construction crews move things when those mansions went up. They told us not to worry. But I remember." The judge leaned back in her chair. "Ms. Reed," she said, addressing Bethany directly, "do you have any evidence that contradicts this testimony or these measurements?" Bethany opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her attorneys whispered urgently to her, but she merely sat there, pale and shaken. The judge tapped her pen once, decisively. "In that case, the court rules as follows. Mr. Cole's 1970s deed and accompanying markers represent the legal and rightful boundary of his property, Structures encroaching on his land are now subject to remedy. A hush fell across the room so completely that Remy could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Judge Hale continued, her tone firm. Mr. Cole is the legal owner of every encroached square foot, including portions of 5 homes within Creekside Bluffs. Bethany gasped. One of her attorneys dropped his pen. Jake exhaled so deeply, it sounded like a prayer. Remy closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the judge's words settle over him, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. He had won the truth. But the fight was far from over. The judge leaned forward. The next question, she said, is whether these homeowners choose demolition or payment. The words didn't echo, but they landed with the weight of a falling tree, heavy, final, shaking the room from floor to ceiling. Several homeowners inhaled sharply, as if the judge had physically struck them. Others sat frozen, stunned into an uneasy stillness. Even the overhead lights flickered once, as if reacting to the shockwave that swept across the courtroom. Remy felt a deep stillness inside him. Not triumph, not gloating, just clarity. What came next wasn't vengeance. It was consequence. Judge Hale straightened the stack of papers before her. For each encroaching structure, the homeowner has 2 options: remove the portion built on Mr. Cole's land or negotiate a rental agreement for continued use. Whispers erupted immediately, soft at first, then louder, nerves unraveling like frayed rope. That's impossible. My garage is built into the slope. You can't expect me to tear down half my patio. This'll ruin our property values. My wife will lose her mind. This is our retirement home. And then, louder than the rest, sharp with disbelief, we shouldn't be punished for trusting the HOA. Remy kept his eyes forward. He wasn't here for their apologies. He wasn't here for their anger either. He was here for the land his father taught him to protect. The same land that had been slowly stolen 1 inch at a time. Bethany Reed finally rose, gripping the edge of the table as though she needed it to stay upright. Her voice wavered, for perhaps the first time in her adult life. Your Honor, surely, for homes of this value, there must be another solution. Judge Hale's gaze didn't soften. Mrs. Reed, property law is not based on home values. It is based on recorded boundaries and legal ownership. A flush crept up Bethany's neck. My pool, my entire backyard, it can't simply be removed, the judge finished, or rented. It must be one or the other. A ripple of murmurs tore through the room again. Beside Remy, Jake leaned in. This is going to get messy. Never thought it'd be clean, Remy murmured back. The judge turned to the bailiff. Please provide each homeowner with a preliminary assessment packet detailing their encroachment areas. The bailiff nodded and began distributing thick envelopes. The tension in the room was palpable, as if the air itself had thickened. Homeowners opened the packets with shaking hands. Nathan Cross, the man with the oversized 4-car garage, went ghost pale as he flipped through his photos and measurements. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered. My garage is 20 feet over the line? We bought this place for the garage. His wife covered her mouth, overwhelmed. The Foster family looked equally devastated, tracing the red-labeled area showing their luxury master suite jutting over Remy's land. It's half our bedroom, Mrs. Foster whispered. Another homeowner threw his packet onto the table in frustration. This is absurd! This is robbery! No, Jake said calmly. This is restitution. Judge Hale lifted her gavel slightly. You will all have 30 days to inform the court of your decision. If you choose removal, demolition scheduling must begin immediately. If you choose rental agreements, you will negotiate directly with Mr. Cole under legal supervision. Remy sat straighter, feeling the weight of those words settle on him like a heavy coat. He wasn't sure he wanted to be anyone's landlord. but he damn well wasn't going to be their victim. One by one, faces turned toward him, some pleading, some angry, some hollow with the realization that their million-dollar dreams had been built on someone else's soil. And then came the moment he had dreaded, or perhaps expected. Bethany Reed approached the bench, voice trembling. "Your Honor, perhaps the court should consider whether Mr. Cole is even capable of managing rental agreements at his age." A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Jake muttered under his breath, "She just never quits." Judge Hale fixed Bethany with a stare sharp enough to cut granite. "Mrs. Reed, you are dangerously close to insulting this court's judgment, and Mr. Cole's competency has not been questioned in any legal capacity. Sit down." Bethany recoiled, stunned silent, and shuffled back to her seat. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the judge delivered the final blow. "Given the severity of the fraudulent survey and the continued use of an illegitimate boundary map, I am ordering a full review of the Creekside Bluffs HOA. State authorities will open a formal investigation into the responsible developer and any parties who knowingly enforced false documents." Gasps filled the air. If panic had shaken the valley before, this announcement cracked it wide open. A board member whispered frantically into his phone. Another resident looked ready to faint. Even Bethany's attorneys suddenly looked like they regretted every billable hour they had collected for this case. Remy didn't move. He simply breathed. Slow, steady. The courtroom felt different now, like the ground had shifted under everyone else, but not under him. The judge gathered her papers. "Court is adjourned." Her gavel fell with a firm, echoing crack. Homeowners stood in a flutter of upset voices, rustling paper, and frantic phone calls. But one thing cut through all the noise, a small, thin envelope sliding across the table toward Remy. He looked down. It was a preliminary rental offer from Bethany Reed herself, $2,000 per month for the right to keep her pool. The same pool she had fought to build. The same pool she had used to find him. The same pool that now legally belonged to him. Jake let out a low whistle. "Well, Remy, looks like she blinked first." Remy folded the envelope without opening it. "This isn't about blinking," he said. "This is about people learning that land doesn't lie." Outside the courthouse, the wind picked up dust from the parking lot and pushed it down the valley toward Creekside Bluffs. Sunlight glinted off the mansions, beautiful, expensive, and suddenly more fragile than ever. Remy stepped into the breeze, letting it cool the heat in his chest. He didn't smile, but he did feel something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Peace. Because the truth had finally been recognized, and now everyone else would have to face it. The first rent check arrived on a soft spring morning, carried by the same mail truck that once delivered a $250,000 threat. This time, the envelope was thin, almost timid-looking, and tucked respectfully between a seed catalog and a flyer for tractor parts. The wind carried the faint scent of thawing earth and pine sap, and the mountains shimmered under the early sun like they approved of the whole situation. Remy stood at his mailbox for a long moment before tearing it open. Inside lay a crisp check and a typed letter. From Nathan Cross, amount $1,500, memo, garage encroachment rental, month 1. He exhaled slowly, not triumph, not amusement, something quieter, something like justice settling into place. He tucked the envelope into his jacket and walked back toward the ranch house. The goats bleated from their pen, irritated that breakfast wasn't coming fast enough. The sound grounded him, reminded him that life kept moving, whether court battles were won or lost. By the time he finished morning chores, 2 more envelopes waited on his porch. The Fosters, paying for the right to keep their luxury master suite intact. Jackson Murphy, begrudgingly covering the rent for his outdoor kitchen that was the pride of his summer parties. Remy shook his head at that one. "Could have asked before you built, Jackson," he muttered. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, listening to the wind brush over the plains. A hawk circled overhead, wings stretched wide. Down in the valley, Creekside bluffs gleamed like nothing had changed, but everything had. A few days later, another envelope arrived. This one different. The handwriting was too careful, too slow, too forced. Inside was a check for $2,000, and the signature at the bottom trembled slightly. Bethany Reed. Remy stared at it for a long time. Not because he needed the money, and not because the amount mattered. It was the symbolism. The woman who had fined him, insulted him, dismissed his deed, questioned his memory, and threatened his land. Now paying him rent to keep her swimming pool. That alone would have satisfied most men. But fate wasn't quite finished with this story. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind where light filtered through the clouds in pale gold streaks, and the ranch felt especially quiet. Remy was repairing a loose hinge on the barn door when he heard the familiar crunch of tires on his driveway. He expected Jake, or maybe Sarah, but when he stepped around the corner, he froze. Bethany Reed stood at the gate. No pink suit, no clipboard, no sunglasses. Just Bethany, hair pulled back, plain gray sweater, hands clasped nervously around a folded set of papers. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked like a regular person. Human. Uneasy. Remy wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward her. "Afternoon," he said, voice neutral. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Cole. Remy, may I speak with you?" He paused, but eventually nodded. "Gates open." She stepped inside and looked around with a mixture of awe and discomfort, as though seeing the ranch for the first time without arrogance clouding her view. The barn, the pasture, the fence line stretching toward the horizon, none of it could be dismissed as outdated paperwork anymore. "I wanted to apologize," she began, voice low, "for everything, for how I handled things, for how I treated you, for assuming that the HOA's documents were more accurate than your family's land." Remy said nothing, just listened. The wind carried her words across the field. Bethany swallowed hard. "I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought following the rules was enough, but I didn't bother to question where those rules came from." She unfolded the papers in her hands, maps, highlighted sections, notes. "I've started the process of stepping down from the HOA board. The investigation, it isn't looking good for the past administration." Remy lifted an eyebrow. "You were part of that administration." A shadow crossed her face. "I know, and I'm willing to accept responsibility, but I'm also trying to fix what I can before it's too late." Silence settled between them, broken only by the creak of the barn roof as a breeze rolled through. She took a careful breath. "I need your help." That surprised him. "With what?" She unfolded a smaller sheet, one that showed the boundary behind her house, a narrow strip of land with a fence leaning at an odd angle. "I want to rebuild the back fence," she said quietly. "Properly this time, on the right line. I don't trust myself to read the coordinates anymore. I was hoping you might show me." Remy studied her face. No entitlement, no posturing, just an uncomfortable honesty. "Why me?" he asked. Bethany hesitated. "Because you know this land better than anyone, and because you deserved better than how I treated you." The wind shifted, rustling the tops of the sagebrush. Remy exhaled, a slow, steady release of something that had been sitting heavy in his chest for months. "All right," he said finally. "Let's take a look." Her shoulders sagged with quiet relief. They walked the fence line together. Remy pointed out the markers. Bethany listened, really listened, for the first time. The afternoon passed with the sound of boots crunching gravel, metal stakes clinking softly under loose soil, and the subtle understanding that some walls had come down while others were being rebuilt the right way. When they returned to the gate, Bethany stopped. "Remy," she said softly. "Thank you." He tipped his hat. "Boundaries don't move, Bethany," he said, "but people can." She nodded, wiped her eyes quickly, and walked back to her car. As her engine faded into the distance, Remy leaned against the fence and looked across the valley at the homes still sitting partly on his land. Symbols not of victory, but of truth finally acknowledged. The fight was nearly over, but one chapter remained. The final shift came quietly, months later, on one of those late summer evenings where the sky glows copper and the cattle shadows stretch long across the fields. The heat of the day softened into a warm breeze that rustled the sagebrush. Somewhere out by the lake, a trout splashed. The world felt settled, peaceful, like it was finally breathing again after holding its breath for far too long. Remy sat on the porch with a fresh cup of coffee, the mug warm in his hands. He had replaced the old porch swing with one made from reclaimed barnwood, something he'd always meant to do but never had the time for. Now he had time. And for the first time in many years, stillness didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like earned quiet. At 4:17 p.m., right on schedule, the mail truck rolled down the dirt road. The driver waved. Remy waved back. In the back of the mailbox sat 5 envelopes, the same 5 that arrived each month, each marked with the same simple routine: rent for use of Remy Cole's land. He opened them one by one. Nathan Cross, the garage he once bragged about now humbly resting in someone else's domain. The Fosters, the master suite they saved rather than tear down. Jackson Murphy, who admitted, grouchily but honestly, that paying rent was cheaper than rebuilding a $12,000 outdoor kitchen. Bethany Reed, whose payments always arrived first, always written with perfect penmanship, and always noticeably steadier than her first shaky check. Remy tucked each envelope into the small wooden lockbox he'd repurposed for rent payments. He didn't count the money. He never did. It wasn't the point. He leaned back, listening to the distant hum of construction. New crews fixing fences, completing mandated repairs, addressing easements the right way this time. The HOA, once loud and unyielding, had been dismantled and rebuilt with the supervision of the county and the unanimous insistence of the residents. The board now consisted of 3 longtime locals, folks who believed in respect, not control. Remy didn't attend the meetings. He didn't need to. He finally trusted who ran them. Life, in its slow and steady way, had settled into something almost poetic. In the afternoons, he'd often walk the boundary lines with Jake, now busier than ever thanks to the surge of new survey requests across the county. They'd talk about nothing and everything: weather, fences, memories of Remy's father pacing those same lines 50 years earlier with a compass and a steady hand. But the most unexpected change came from Bethany. One crisp Saturday morning, she arrived again, this time with gardening gloves and a notebook. She asked, not demanded, if she could walk the creek edge behind her property to understand her land better. Remy obliged. They walked together under the shade of tall pines, the sound of water trickling over rocks filling the quiet. Bethany spoke softly, almost shyly. "I used to think paperwork and authority made someone right," she said. "I see now that understanding where you stand matters more." Remy nodded. "Took me a while to learn that too." "No," she replied with a gentle, almost rueful smile. "You always knew. I was the one who needed reminding." It wasn't friendship, not exactly, but it was something like respect, and sometimes that was more valuable. As twilight settled over the valley, Remy found himself walking the old boundary line one more time. The grass bent in the evening wind. The fence posts, straightened, reinforced, and repainted, stood proud against the setting sun. Those same posts his father had dug into the ground with calloused hands decades ago. He paused by the oldest one, the one they first found the fake survey tried to erase. He rested his hand on the rough grain of the wood. The world had changed. Creekside bluffs had changed. Even he had changed in ways he didn't expect. But this line, this truth, it never bowed. As he reached the hilltop overlooking the neighborhood, the lights flickered on one by one, warm yellows, soft whites, reflections shimmering off the valley lake. Those homes didn't look like invaders anymore. They looked like neighbors. They looked like people learning to stand on ground honestly, even if they had to pay rent to do it. Remy took in the view, the breeze brushing gently against him like a familiar hand on the shoulder. And he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not bitterness, not even triumph. Peace. Hard-earned peace. He tipped his hat against the fading sunlight and said softly to the quiet valley, "Next time someone tells you to move your fence, make sure they're standing on the right side of yours." Then he turned, heading back to his porch, ready to watch the sky fade from gold to indigo, knowing that justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply settled in. If this story hit close to home, drop a simple justice in the comments, or tell me if you've ever had to stand your ground against an HOA. Stories like Remy's remind us that land may have boundaries, but dignity sure doesn't. And if you'd like to hear more real ranch, land rights, and HOA justice tales, go on and subscribe. I'd be glad to have you ride along for the next one.